That knock was never like any other knock. Two firm raps, a short pause, then one more, a rhythm every child on a working-class British street in the 1970s could identify from 2 rooms away, long before they were old enough to understand exactly what it meant. And the second it landed on the door, your mum's whole posture changed, whatever she'd been doing a moment before, instantly forgotten. There aren't many people left who instantly knew what that knock meant. If you did, you grew up in a Britain that's quietly disappearing. So let's go back in time and walk through exactly what happened next. There were, in most streets, 2 very different knocks that mattered, and every family learned to tell them apart without ever being taught. The rent man came weekly, usually on the same day, usually around the same hour, collecting for a landlord who in a huge number of working-class households wasn't a bank or a company, but an actual person, sometimes local, sometimes barely known at all, beyond his handwriting in a small book. The insurance man, sometimes called the club man or the Provident man depending on your street and your accent, came for something else entirely. A few pence a week, toward a policy that would, decades later, and completely without drama, pay for a funeral nobody wanted to think about yet. Both men carried the same object, more or less. A small book, thin card cover, columns ruled in faded ink, your family's payments recorded in a neat row of ticks and figures that told the entire financial story of your household to anyone who knew how to read it. That book lived somewhere specific in the house, usually a kitchen drawer or on the mantelpiece, and everyone in the family knew exactly where it was, because everyone in the family understood, on some level, how much it mattered. On a good week, the whole exchange took less than 5 minutes and barely interrupted anything. Your mum answered the door with the coins already counted out, sometimes wrapped in a bit of paper, sometimes just held loose in her palm. The man stepped just far enough into the doorway to be polite, without actually coming inside, wrote the payment into the book with a stub of pencil kept behind his ear, and handed it back with a nod. If it was the insurance man, and if there was time, he might linger for a minute or two, a comment about the weather, a question about how the kids were doing at school, small talk that wasn't really about anything, but mattered anyway, because he saw the same handful of streets every single week and knew more about the ordinary rhythms of people's lives than almost anyone else who wasn't family. Sometimes you weren't hidden away for the transaction at all. Sometimes you were brought right into the middle of it, stood beside your mum at the door on a good week, watching the whole small ceremony unfold from close up. You'd watch her count the coins out loud under her breath before the knock even came, watch the exact way she held herself a little straighter the moment she opened the door, polite and composed, regardless of how the week had actually gone. You learned, just from standing there often enough, exactly how an adult was supposed to present themselves in a moment like that. Steady, unbothered, entirely in control, whatever might have been happening behind the front door 5 minutes earlier. On a bad week, the whole atmosphere in the house changed the moment that knock landed. If the money genuinely wasn't there, and in a working-class household in that decade, some weeks it genuinely wasn't. The response wasn't panic exactly, but a kind of practiced quiet. Curtains that had been open all morning might suddenly not be. A child might be sent to answer the door with careful instructions already given, in a low voice moments before, "Tell him Mum's not in. Tell him she'll catch him next week." You said it because you were told to, not because you understood the full weight of what you were saying, and the man on the doorstep, who had almost certainly heard some version of that sentence 100 times before, from 100 different children on 100 different streets, usually just nodded, wrote something small in the corner of his own book, and went on his way without making a scene of it. Children on a street had their own quiet early warning system for exactly this situation, passed between houses without any adult ever organizing it. If the rent man's van or bike was spotted at the top of the road, word traveled fast. a whisper over a garden fence, a signal between houses that had done this dance with each other for years. More than one child spent a genuinely tense few minutes acting as lookout from a front window, ready to report back the second the coast was clear, taking the responsibility with the total seriousness only a 9-year-old on an important mission could manage. It wasn't seen as anything shameful among the children themselves. It was simply part of how the street operated, understood, and never really discussed. A single missed week rarely caused any real trouble. Everyone understood that money was tight sometimes, and the system had enough give built into it to absorb the odd bad Tuesday without anyone panicking. But if the missed weeks started stacking up, 2, then 3, then more, the tone of the visits changed gradually and unmistakably. The nod became a little less warm, the small talk disappeared entirely. The pencil marks in the book started to carry a weight that everyone in the house could feel, even if nobody said it out loud. In the most serious cases, a rent arrears situation could eventually mean a visit from someone more formal than the regular collector, and in a small number of households, it meant the genuine fear of losing the roof over your head, a fear that never quite left some people, even decades later, long after their own circumstances had completely changed. This wasn't really about anyone trying to cheat anyone else, and it's worth saying that plainly. It was about a system built entirely on trust and reputation, operating in a world where wages didn't always stretch evenly across every single week of the month. A bad week wasn't a moral failing. It was Tuesday in a huge number of working-class British households, and everybody involved in the system, the collector as much as the family, understood that and worked around it with a quiet dignity that neither side ever really talked about out loud. There's a version of this story that could easily tip into embarrassment, into treating these weekly visits as evidence of hardship and nothing more. But that misses something important about how this generation actually experienced it. Managing tight money with genuine skill, keeping every payment up to date through sheer, careful discipline, was itself a source of real pride in working-class households, not shame. A mum who never once missed a payment, who always had the coins ready before the knock even came, carried that fact with quiet dignity. It said something about her, about the household she ran, about the family she was holding together on wages that never quite stretched as far as anyone would have liked. The system asked a great deal of the people managing it week after week, and most of them met that demand with a level of quiet competence that rarely gets acknowledged properly now. Door-to-door collection existed at all because of something that's easy to forget now. Most working-class families in the 1970s simply didn't have a bank account. Wages were often paid in cash, in a small brown envelope, and managed entirely by hand, week to week, in a system that had grown up long before direct debits or standing orders were anything close to universal. The rent man and the insurance man weren't relics of an older, less efficient time. They were the actual financial infrastructure of ordinary British life, walking the same streets every week because there was, quite simply, no other practical way for the money to move. A single street in that decade might see 4 or 5 different collectors pass through in the course of an ordinary week, each with their own particular knock, their own particular book, their own particular relationship with the families on the round. The betterware man selling household goods door to door, the clean-a's man with his brushes and polishes, the pools collector on a Thursday, gathery coupons and small stakes for the football pools, with the same quiet ritual as the rent man's book. Each of them became, in their own way, a familiar fixture of the street's weekly rhythm, faces that children grew up recognizing by silhouette alone, long before they were close enough to see who it actually was. There was a third familiar knock too, less frequent but just as recognizable, the tallyman, or the Provident cheque man, who didn't collect money so much as extend a very particular kind of trust. He sold vouchers, checks that could be spent in certain local shops for clothes, shoes, or household goods, paid back gradually over the following weeks in small, manageable amounts. For a family that needed school shoes before payday, but couldn't stretch to buying them outright, the Provident man solved a real problem in a dignified, unhurried way, without ever making anyone feel like they were asking for charity. He, too, kept a book. He, too, knew every family on his round by name and adjusted his expectations week to week according to circumstances he never needed explained to him twice. The insurance itself deserves its own moment of attention, because what it actually paid for tells you something real about the anxieties of that generation. These weren't grand life insurance policies in the way we might think of them today. They were almost always modest burial policies, a few pence a week, paid faithfully for years or even decades, building toward a sum that would one day cover a funeral without leaving the family in debt, or worse, relying on charity to bury one of their own. This mattered enormously to a generation that had, in many cases, grown up hearing stories from their own parents about paupers' funerals and the particular shame that came with them. Paying into that book every week wasn't really about death. It was about dignity, quietly insured against, one small coin at a time. Children absorbed all of this without ever being formally told any of it. You knew, without anyone explaining, that Thursday was rent day and Friday was the insurance man, or whatever the specific rhythm was on your particular street. You knew which knock meant you could carry on with whatever you were doing, and which knock meant you needed to go quiet, or disappear upstairs, or answer the door with a rehearsed sentence you didn't fully understand, but delivered convincingly anyway, because children in that world learned early how to read a room and act accordingly. There was also, on the good weeks, a genuine warmth to the whole ritual that's easy to overlook if you only focus on the tension of the bad ones. The insurance man in particular often became something close to a fixture in a family's life over the years. The same face, the same voice, the same small talk, week after week, for so long that some collectors knew 3 generations of the same family by name, watched children grow up simply by watching them get slightly taller each year at the same front door. When he retired, or moved on, or was replaced, it wasn't unusual for a family to feel a small, genuine loss, the way you might feel about any familiar presence who had quietly been part of the furniture of your week for the better part of your childhood. The rent man's relationship with a family tended to be a little more formal, a little more transactional, in part because the stakes attached to it were higher. Falling behind on insurance meant, at worst, a lapsed policy you could sometimes reinstate. Falling behind on rent, in the wrong circumstances, could mean something far more serious. So while the insurance man's visit often had room for a chat and a moment of warmth, the rent man's visit tended to stay a little more businesslike, a little more careful on both sides, even in households where the relationship was perfectly amicable. Christmas brought its own particular version of all this, and it's one of the moments where the whole system's real purpose became clearest. Many families paid into a separate Christmas club through the year, specifically so that December wouldn't catch them short, a small weekly amount, building steadily from as early as January toward the cost of presents, food, and everything else the season demanded. The clubman's book, opened out on the kitchen table in early December, represented months of quiet discipline finally paying off, and for a family that had kept up with it faithfully all year, there was real pride in that final visit, the moment the saved amount was finally handed over in full. By the later part of the decade and increasingly through the 80s, this entire system began to change, and it changed for reasons that had very little to do with anyone's choice and everything to do with the wider economy shifting underneath it. Bank accounts slowly became more common among working-class families, partly because employers increasingly paid wages directly into an account rather than in cash, and partly because building societies and banks began actively courting customers who had never previously been considered worth the effort. Direct debits and standing orders began to quietly take over the job that a man walking the streets with a book and a pencil had done for generations. None of this happened overnight, and none of it happened evenly. In plenty of streets, the collector kept coming for years after the practice had started dying out elsewhere, partly out of habit, partly because some families simply preferred it that way, preferred a human face and a familiar voice to a faceless number disappearing from an account they couldn't see or touch. But the direction of travel was clear, and by the time most of today's viewers were adults themselves, the whole system had all but vanished, replaced by something more efficient and considerably less personal. What's lost in that efficiency is worth sitting with for a moment. A door-to-door collector wasn't just moving money from one place to another. He was, whether anyone thought of it this way at the time or not, a form of quiet social contact built directly into the structure of ordinary economic life. Someone who saw you every week, who noticed if something seemed wrong, who represented, in his own small and unglamorous way, a kind of accountability and connection that a standing order simply cannot replicate. You can't have a chat with a direct debit. You can't tell a bank statement that things are a bit tight this week and have it nod, write something small in the corner, and quietly understand. You didn't think of any of this as significant at the time. It was simply Thursday, or Friday, or whatever day it happened to be on your particular street. A knock, a book, a few coins, a familiar face, gone again, within minutes. But it was, in its own understated way, one of the last places in ordinary British life where money and trust and community all sat in the same small transaction, conducted on a doorstep, week after week, for decades, until it quietly disappeared. So tell us, was it the rent man, the insurance man, or the Provident man who knocked at your door? Do you remember acting as lookout on a bad week, or was your family always ready with the coins counted out? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear exactly how it worked on your street. If this brought it all back, hit like, share it with someone who'll remember that exact knock, and subscribe to Yesterday's Britain for more of these every week. Thank you for watching.